Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Module 3, in which we're going to be looking at the history of ancient Greece. If you want to follow along, go ahead and download the PDF files. This particular lecture is Ancient Greece 1 and 2. You should also download the Module 3 guided notes. These aren't for a grade, but if you get those notes, print them off or put them on your computer and kind of follow along, type in the answers or write them in while you watch the videos and look over the PowerPoints, it'll set you up to be successful on the quizzes. So that's just kind of a tool I wanted to give you to kind of organize some of this information. So yeah, if you have that, that'll help you a lot. Like I said, this particular lecture is Ancient Greece 1 and 2. So if you want to get that out in front of you, that kind of help to follow along. I'm not going to go over every slide. I'll jump around a little bit. Sometimes when I build the slides, I put in more information than I actually end up wanting to talk about. So some of that's just an added bonus, but if you want to follow along, it's Ancient Greece 1 and 2. Okay, let me get it out here. All right. So if you look at slide 2, basically the history of ancient Greece is just divided into different eras or ages: the Bronze Age, the Dark Ages, the Archaic period, the Classical period, the Hellenistic period. Eventually, the Romans kind of eclipse the Greeks and we forget about the Greeks. Ancient Greece is divided into kind of two broader periods: the Hellenic period and the Hellenistic period. The Hellenic period is the time of Greek history before Alexander the Great, and the Hellenistic period is the time of Greek history after Alexander the Great. So make sure you know those two terms. What did the Greeks do to influence Western civilization? Well, they did a lot. They gave us democracy. We get the writing of history from them. They had philosophers that passed ideas down to us. They had a lot of poems and plays that we still read today. Their architecture and sculpture still influence us today. So the Greeks gave us a lot as far as Western civilization. What are our sources for studying the ancient Greeks? Well, there's kind of two main categories: physical things like clay pots, tablets, buildings, and then written sources. You know, things like the Theogony, the Iliad, the Odyssey, philosophy plays. The Greek writing that comes from the Bronze Age is called Linear B. I'll talk more about that here in a little bit. During the Archaic period, writers such as Hesiod and Homer wrote works such as the Theogony and Works and Days. That was written by Hesiod, and then you get the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two most famous works of literature from the Greeks. Those were attributed to Homer. He didn't come up with them, but he gets credit for them. You know, we've got historians such as Herodotus and Thucydides. We've got writings of Plato and Aristotle, plays of poetry. So we have a lot of written stuff to look at. If you look at slide 9, I just kind of have a quick slide that shows you the geography of Greece. So, you know, if you're reading about Greece and they throw out these terms, you kind of know where they're at. One thing that's important to remember is the geographical fragmentation of Greece leads to the political fragmentation of Greece. So Greece never is a nation in the ancient world. It's a bunch of city-states, and we'll kind of explain that as we go. The Greeks called themselves Hellenes, and they called their land Hellas. They didn't call themselves Greeks. The Romans are the ones that called them the Greeks. That's where we get our term the Greeks, is from the Romans. During the 19th century, there's some pretty important archaeological finds. Heinrich Schliemann finds Mycenae and Troy. A lot of historians didn't think the Trojan War existed, the city of Troy existed, but then thanks to archaeology, they find out it actually did occur and the city does exist. These sites, Troy and Mycenae, are central pieces to the Iliad, Homer's kind of epic poem. Because of a lot of civilization took place during this time at Mycenae, historians call this the Mycenaean period of Greek history. Another great archaeologist, Sir Arthur Evans, he found the palace complex of Knossos on Crete. There's legends about a great king named Minos that lived at Knossos. Evans named the civilization the Minoan civilization after King Minos. So there's two Aegean civilizations that we're going to look at. The first is the Minoan and the second is the Mycenaean. Okay, so first the Minoans, I'm on slide 18. Like I said, attributed to Sir Arthur Evans. He kind of discovers this civilization. Because of all the palaces that they find on the island of Crete, sometimes historians and archaeologists call this palatial society, just to describe the similar complexes throughout the island of Crete. I've got a lot of pictures there you can see of some of the excavations, some of the paintings on the walls. It's pretty cool. If you look at slide 27, I've got a little YouTube link there. You can click on it. It'll just give you kind of a virtual tour of what the palace may have looked like when it was, still built before it kind of crumbled and the Minoans kind of vanished. Minoan civilization had a writing system called Linear A. We find these tablets, but we don't know what Linear A says. We haven't deciphered it yet. It was probably used for economic and administrative records. This suggests that the Minoans had some type of bureaucracy in place. Another kind of element of Minoan civilization is the lack of fortifications. This suggests that the Minoans may have been a peaceful people, or maybe they had a different method of defense. Some scholars have argued that the seas around Crete served as kind of the walls of Crete. So if you look at slide 31, the navy or the seas, that's kind of the walls, the forward defenses of the Cretan Empire. If you look at slide 32, there's some Linear A tablet fragments. If you look at slides 33 and 34, you can kind of see how Crete is at the crossroads of the kind of world we've been studying so far. You've got the Near East, you got Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece. They find stuff on Crete from all of these places, which leads them to believe that Crete was kind of at the crossroads of a trading network. The economy during the Minoan civilization is something called the palace economy. Basically, you have a centralized kind of system. People grow food, make products, they bring them to the palace. The palace kind of oversees their distribution. We don't know a lot about Minoan religion because we haven't deciphered their writings. We do find cave and house sanctuaries, and sometimes they'll have religious trinkets or kind of little idols that they'll dig up, shrines. So they did have religion, we just don't know a lot about it. On the island of Thera, there's a town, Akrotiri. It's a good example of kind of how the Minoans kind of branched out and spread their culture to other areas. I've got some pictures of this you can kind of look at. Okay, eventually the Minoan civilization gets eclipsed and we kind of focus on Mycenaean civilization. And these civilizations are concurrent, but they flourish at different periods. The Minoans flourish first and then the Mycenaeans flourish. There is a debate how much influence the Minoans had on mainland Greece. Did the Minoans colonize mainland Greece, or is Mycenaean culture totally separate and it just absorbed some of the Minoan influences? Scholars are pretty sure that mainland Greece, Mycenae, conquered the Minoans around 1400 BC. Our sources for Mycenaean civilization there's basically three main sources. Linear B, that's a form of Greek writing that has been deciphered. This guy named Michael Ventris deciphered it. We have Homer and his epic poems. They tell us a lot about Mycenaean civilization. And then we have archaeology. So there's a lot of Mycenaean sites that have been dug up, and we kind of study them and learn about the Mycenaeans. If you look at slide 52, this is kind of cool. This is the Thalos tomb. Sometimes it's nicknamed the Beehive tomb. You can see it's a fairly intricate tomb. You would bury somebody, very prominent in here. I've got some pictures of some of the stuff they found in these Thalos tombs, and some pictures. If you look at slide 55, you can see a person in one of these, so it shows you how large they are. The citadel at Mycenae at slide 56 and 57, you can kind of see the size of these city walls. So the Mycenaeans needed city walls more than the Minoans, so perhaps they were more warlike. Here's kind of an interesting story. If you look at slide 58, there's a character in the Iliad and the Odyssey called King Nestor. For a long time, scholars thought the Iliad and the Odyssey were totally fictional, made up stories, no truth to them. Um, in the Iliad, Homer tells us about King Nestor, who lives in a town called Pylos. Well, in the 1930s, they dug up a palace in Pylos, and the name Nestor was attributed to the palace. So there is some truth to the Iliad and the Odyssey. Some of the names may have been real, some of the places are real. Um, if you look at slide 59, that's kind of a map. You can see where Pylos is. You can see slide 60, a layout of the palace of Nestor. So the Mycenaeans, like I said, eclipsed the Minoans. They wrote in Linear B. They had Thalos tombs. They had large fortified sites, strong defenses. Their leaders were warrior kings, so they had political military leaders were the same thing. Okay, so Homer can tell us a lot about the Mycenaeans. Maybe before the archaeological finds, we wouldn't have believed so, but now we kind of do. So Homer is the author of the epic poems Iliad and Odyssey, and I use that term author loosely. Um, he was an oral poet, and lots of people told the stories, but he gets credit for it. The Iliad and the Odyssey kind of serve as sacred texts for the Greeks. If you were growing up in ancient Greece, you would probably have the Iliad and the Odyssey. You'd be pretty familiar with them, and this would allow you to know the values of kind of the Greeks. There's lots of stories of heroism and bravery and courage and treason and cowardice in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So you would have all these characters, and you would know who the hero is and who the villain is. So you would have moral exemplars to follow, good examples, bad examples, good examples to follow, bad examples to avoid. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the plot of the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you haven't read them, you should. They're pretty cool. Basically, the virtues in Homeric society or the Mycenaean society is anything that makes you, a good fighter, a good leader. So bravery, self-control, wisdom, loyalty to your friends, hatred of your enemies. Those are things you should follow. Some basic units in Homeric society. You have the demos, which is the geographical unit of people in the surrounding territory. The leader of the demos was the basileus. This is the chief or the king. They don't have absolute power, but they do lead. If you read the Iliad, a lot of times the basileus, if he's about to go to war, he'll gather his kind of fellow chieftains. He's the head chieftain, and he can't just order them to go to war. He'll have to convince them to go to war. So, if you're a basileus, you don't have absolute rule over everybody. There's a line from the Iliad where Peleus talks to his son Achilles, and he says, "Be both a speaker of words and a doer of deeds." So that's kind of good qualities to have. There's this value called xenia. It means guest friendship, just providing hospitality to foreigners. There's a scene in the Iliad where Diomedes and Glaucus one's a Greek and one's a Trojan. I can't ever keep it straight. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they're fighting. There's hundreds of people fighting each other, and they're about to fight each other. And one of them says to the other, "Hey, I remember my grandfather came to your grandfather, and he showed him xenia. He showed him guest friendship. So we shouldn't kill each other on the battlefield." So that's kind of a value. Law during the Homeric era or the Mycenaean era is kind of a private matter. If somebody murders someone in your family, it's your job to take care of it. It's not the higher law of the society or the courts. Those don't really exist. The fundamental unit of society in the Greek Dark Ages, which is coming up a little bit, but this is also kind of true during the Mycenaean period. It's the oikos. This is the family, the house, the property. So the family could be you, your wife, children, your extended family, your house, your property could be your land and slaves. Okay, if you look at slide 86, what destroyed the Minoans, the Mycenaeans? There's a lot of different theories. I'm not going to go over these with you, but you can kind of peek at them if you want. A lot of theories. We're not exactly sure what it is, but there's different theories. All right, so after the Mycenaean civilization flourishes, it starts to collapse. 1200 to 1100 BC, you have the destruction of a lot of the major Mycenaean sites. This ushers in the Greek Dark Ages. The Greek Dark Ages are roughly 1150 to 700 BC. You have a serious decline in the number and size of settlements throughout Greece. You have the loss of palaces, you have the loss of writing, you have the loss of wide-scale trade, you have the loss of production, you have depopulation and deurbanization. So the Greek Dark Ages is just a period of decline, and it ends with the rise of the polis. We'll talk about that in a later lecture, but the polis, the emergence of the polis or the Greek city-state kind of is seen as the end of the Greek Dark Ages. Life was simple during the Dark Ages. Society is still structured around the oikos, but basically things kind of slow down. Everything's on a smaller scale. A lot of what we know about the Greek Dark Ages comes from pottery. You don't have to remember this pottery, but I've got some pictures up here of proto-geometric pottery. You can see how it's basic, geometrical shapes, circles, squares, rectangles, lines. Um, Later on, you get geometric pottery, which is more intricate shapes. You get the meander pattern, which is just like it sounds. The lines kind of meander around. Um, Eventually, you get late geometric pottery, and you can see on slide 98, you start to have intricate pictures on here. This is a funeral scene. Later, you get black figure and red figure pottery. So as the Dark Ages progress, you start getting more intricate pottery, which leads archaeologists and scholars to assume, hey, they're kind of coming out of the Dark Ages if their pottery is getting more complex. During the Dark Ages, there's a lot of new settlement around the Aegean Sea. The Aegean Sea kind of gets nicknamed the Greek Sea because there's Greeks all around it. Like I said, there's kind of a revival during the Dark Ages. So 1150 to 900 is more of the decline, and then 900 to 750 BC is kind of where the revival takes place. Some historians talk about an archaic revolution. This is when you get the writings of Homer, you get the emergence of the polis, you get colonization, you get trade. So that's kind of why those years are seen as kind of a revival instead of more decline. Greek colonization goes on about a couple hundred years, 800 to 600, 750 to 500 BC. Different textbooks will give you different numbers. But basically, the Greeks needed more imported goods. They needed new lands for the polis. The polis is just the plural form of polis. You need fertile lands to help ease hunger in the polis. And sending out people is a good way to release social tensions in your polis. If you look at slides 104, you can kind of see the areas the Greeks colonized. The two main areas the Greeks colonized are the area around the Black Sea and basically southern Italy and Sicily. These are great places to grow grains. That's why the Greeks went there. So the Black Sea region and Italy, southern Italy and Sicily. The mother city was called the metropolis. So the polis of Corinth might send out an expedition to found a colony. So Corinth would be the metropolis. The colony that gets established would be the apoikia. That just means home away from home. So Corinth, the metropolis, founded Syracuse, the apoikia. The biggest cultural achievement that the Greeks achieved during the Dark Ages was the Greek alphabet. So if you look at slide 109, you can see the Greek alphabet there. This occurred around 800 BC, so that's kind of the greatest achievement of the Greeks. There's two really important sites I want to talk about, Delphi and Olympia. If you saw them around slide 110, 111. Delphi was a place where there was an oracle of Apollo. So basically, it's a religious site. People would go there to ask the oracle all kinds of questions about life. Um, so Delphi is a very important religious site in Greek history. At the oracle at Delphi, there would be a priestess called the Pythia. She would basically go into a trance and she would receive communications from the gods or from Apollo, and then uh, interpreters would interpret her message and kind of tell everyone what she was saying. We'll talk more about the oracle at Delphi when we talk about the Persian Wars. Olympia was the site of the Olympic Games, which were founded in 776 BC. Olympia is a religious site. It's sanctuary. It's neutral to all Greeks. Therefore, it's a good place to hold these competitions. Um, the Olympic Games helped build this sense of Greekness. It helped build culture and values. There's this Greek word eris, good strife versus bad strife. Um, think about if you have a vineyard, to kind of use, something that would match with the ancient Greeks. You have a vineyard because you want to make wine. Let's say your neighbor plants a vineyard and it's better than you. How are you going to deal with this? This is kind of strife. Are you going to handle it the good way or the bad way? The good way would be to go out, cultivate your lands, make your vineyard better. The bad way to deal with this strife would be to go out and tear up your neighbor's vineyard at night so he can't compete with you. So you want to kind of to partake in the good eris, the good strife, because that will make you a better person in the end, not the bad strife. At the end of the Dark Ages, you have population growth, you have new technology. Think of the pottery we talked about. It kind of progressed. You get political centralization in the rise of the polis. Trade grows. You have more contact with the outside world, especially the East. Writing is reintroduced. Um, you have the growth of the aristocracy. So I'm on slide 121. Basically, aristocratia means power in the hands of the best men. So you start to have these elite families that compete with the basileus for basically power over the polis, the city-state. After the Greek Dark Ages, you have the Archaic Age, so about 700 to 500 BC. You have the rise of the polis. The polis is just, like I said, Greek word for city-state, so Athens, Sparta, etc. are the polis. Look at slide 123. The polis is made up of the Asti and the Chora, so the city and the surrounding lands. That's what makes up the polis. And I'll show you a map when we talk about Athens and Sparta that kind of explains this more. How did the polis replace the basileus? Well, over time, the basileus has to compete with kind of new landowning aristocracy. Various leadership roles of the basileus are handed out to the various aristocrats. You start to have council of elders in a lot of these city-states, so they take some of the power away. A lot of times a polis was run by a few families or a few rich people. This would be called an oligarchia, which just means the rule of the few. Um, Slide 127, how is the polis divided up economically and socially? It's different in every polis. There's no way to say it's one way. Usually you have aristocrats on top. You might have some type of middle class. Some places had these people called thetes. They were those who worked for wages. This was kind of seen as beneath the dignity of a lot of the aristocrats. They would call thetes naked ones, those with dusty feet, or the wearer of sheepskins. Those are kind of insults. Militarily speaking, the hoplites, they're the backbone of the Greek military. They're the heavily armed foot soldiers who serve in the phalanx formation. If you look at slide 130, you can see a phalanx formation right there. Basically, it's a large group of men. They got a shield, helmet, spear, and sword, and they would kind of push against another phalanx formation in battle. The hoplon is the round shield that's made of wood, and it's usually covered with leather or bronze. You would put your arm in the shield. That's how the hoplites get their name, from those big round shields, the hoplons. The tactics for fighting in the phalanx would be something called the pushing. Basically, the two groups of phalanxes get together and they just, whichever one can push the other one around, usually wins. If you look at slide 134, there's some of the weapons they would use. So you've got that Hoplon shield. You would have something called a Corinthian helmet. You would have uh, the Melar armor or cuirass armor, kind of fits your body, usually leather straps. You would have a spear called a dory, a long spear with a pointy sharp, and then a counterweight on the back so you could balance it and reach out across the phalanx and stab your enemies. You would have a short sword called a xiphos. This would be used maybe once things got too close to use your spears. It's a secondary weapon. One of the main political developments of the Archaic period is that something that historians call the Age of Tyrants. Tyrants they rise during the Archaic period. Now, a tyrant is not necessarily a bad thing. A tyrant just means somebody whose rule is illegitimate. It means they seized power. It has nothing to do about the way they rule. There's a lot of tyrants that ancient Greeks thought did a good job. Yeah, they got power illegitimately. They stole an election. They seized it by force. But hey, once they ruled, they actually did a pretty good job. Um, so you can read slide 139, some of the characteristics of tyrants. On slide 140, I have a quote from Aristotle, kind of sums up uh, the way things worked. A lot of times, tyrants kind of saved the people from the aristocrats. So a lot of times, the people actually liked the tyrants better than the aristocrats, and for this reason, tyrants a lot of times got called demagogues. From this word demagogoi, sorry, leaders of the people. They basically appeal to the people against the aristocrats. Okay, that's kind of my introduction to Greek history. Next time, we'll kind of look at Athens and Sparta, and then we'll kind of get into some of the wars the Greeks fight.